Hello and good morning. Good morning. Welcome to our 2023 Fall Forum series. And today's Fall Forum is focused on employer benefits and public policies, innovative formulas to fuel inclusive housing. Thank you for being here. And my name is Sheree Ingram, and I work as the Managing Director of Employer Services and Consulting here for the Center for Economic Inclusion. And I'll share more about myself later. But first, I'd like to take a moment to do two acknowledgements. In order to ground myself and our time together today discussing topics such as land use, home ownership, mortgage denial, terms like 30% AMI, or even talking about construction, I will first acknowledge that through imperfect mapping projects and glimpses into our nation's and our state's history, I learned that the First Nations occupied this space long before us. And I am humbled to honor this traditional territory, as it is a reminder that there's a long history before colonization of the people with a rich culture, steeped in tradition and understanding that all things are connected, and who did and continue to honor the land. I acknowledge also that some sources from scholars, researchers, historians, and culture keepers taught me that roughly 100 million enslaved Africans underwent inhumane passage to these lands after forced removal of many First Nations, all by the United States. And enslaved Africans' intellectual property, physical body, and labor were exploited for nearly 250 years to build the economy that we know, experience, and benefit from today, and have yet to be repaid from the global economy they worked for free to build. And the legacy of this truth lives today, as slavery did not end, but evolved to anti-Black state sanctioned laws that leaders from this community and their trusted allies continue to resist in an effort to build a new future. So thank you for making this time to acknowledge land and labor. And now I want to welcome you all to today's forum by introducing yourselves. So please share with us your name and your organization in the chat. Take a moment and so that we can all see who is in the room. And as you all do that, I will share a little bit about the center's purpose. The center operates in this region as a convener and a bridge builder. So I implore that you read the chat and see who else is here. Make intentional connections around this energy in today's topic. Share contact information, emails, and phone numbers. Get to know one another. Network and use today to organize for tomorrow. You're welcome. And now a little bit about our team. I am one of a small yet mighty team of leaders that are working diligently and intentionally to transform this region. The Center for Economic Inclusion is led by founder and CEO Tawana Black, and our many team members that make this work possible. There are so many people that are monitoring the chat and supporting this webinar, so thank you all. Hello. How are we working to diligently and intentionally transform this region? We work to change through education, research, consulting, projects, and policy advocacy. And we believe that 2,400 leaders, including you all here today, with the right awareness, can take action that can transform our region. And together, we can be accountable for sustaining the change that we want to see. What is the change that we want to see? Here at the center, we believe that only the full economic participation of people of color will unlock our region's potential for growth. We want to see a region that is powered by the full economic participation of all people. And I'd like for each of us to take a moment to reflect on the change that we want to see. It is so important to me that as a leader of this work and sitting in this space and having the honor to moderate today's forum, that I also engage from an authentic place, and that I will encourage all of us to consider, why does housing, or why does home matter to you? Today, we have incredible leaders that will share policies and practices and resource flows that can support transformative change. And yet, through our work here at the center, we use FSG's model, a partner of ours, their model for systems change, which we understand that we have to examine not only those explicit actions, but our implicit actions, as we are responsible for examining our mental models, our proximity and relationships, and our power dynamics that also maintain Black and Brown people's limited economic participation in our regional economy. Now, so why does it matter to me? I'll share with you all that I went on Google and found my childhood home. And 1715 Urban Avenue North was not just a place for me, but it was safety. And it was foundation that I would later understand was pivotal for what I now know was a hierarchy of needs. It was also a source of attachment and holds so many memories. It shaped my identity and who I am today and who you see here. And now I invite you to take a moment and consider your personal why, what home means to you, and reflect on that. Reflect on some of the mental models you may hold about homes or housing or solving something like a housing crisis. Consider proximity. Are we talking about this issue as if it's something that needs to be solved over there? Or are our relationships and connections close to the people most impacted by our housing crisis? I hope that you'll take a moment to situate and ground yourself in an authentic space as we participate in conversations around transformative change and inclusive strategies that will fuel housing and regional economic growth. And so to do that, I'll frame up the discussion in the way that only the center can, and that is by being a data-informed organization that holds our collective accountability on its website in the form of indicators for an inclusive regional economy. Our discussion today will be framed by some metro area population level insights. According to some recent reports from Equity Atlas, the share of renters who are rent burdened nationwide has increased from 40% back in 2000 to 50% in 2022. And so let me give you the takeaway formula and why this data matters. Rising rents plus stagnant wages equals housing instability. And that's an unnecessary crisis that we have to contend with as a region. And businesses are not exempt. Next slide. They pay. They pay losing engaged employees, the contributions of many qualified candidates who from 5 p.m. to 9 a.m. have to navigate the realities of all of these data points. For example, median renter income growing by 1%, while median rents increased 14% from 2000 to 2019. So we would be remiss to expect employee engagement at its highest if majority of our team members' experience is one of household burden by monthly rents. Next slide, please. Minnesota also ranks at the top of the nation's list for the largest racial disparities in homeownership. And for many of you, this data might not be new. But in Minnesota Housing Partnership reports that 77% of white households own their homes, while 60% of Asian households own, 50% of Hispanic households own, 49% of Native households own, and 25% of Black households own their homes. And why such stark disparities? Our nation's history of race is one that is race and housing, I should say, is one that is deep and complex. And we continue to see that history play out in our outcomes today. And so data from a key step in the home buying process for many potential home buyers shows that racial disparities remain consistent, denying Black and brown applicants at a much higher rate than their white counterparts. So this data that I've shared with you all today informs us that our current policies and practices in housing across sectors and institutions prove to be exclusive to locking Black and brown people out of livable wages, wealth creation, greater housing stability, and opportunity for upward mobility by way of affordable housing and equitable homeownership. And this means that we, employers, legislators, bankers, processors, program directors, and decision makers, we get in our own way. The silver lining of all of this, though, is that just as policies and practices were created, they can be recreated. And I am excited to explore the ways that we can and we will recreate housing policies and practices that understand how foundational home is and how we all benefit when housing is safe and affordable for all people. So first up, I'm going to welcome my colleague, Heather Worthington, our managing consultant here at the Center for Economic Inclusion, to share a little bit more about why this matters.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Sheree. So, Sheree, I so appreciate how you kind of set this up for us so that we can better understand some of the policies and practices that have impacted Black and brown home ownership over the last century or so here in the Twin Cities. Just want to ground us in a little bit of historical data here. First of all, this is a map of Minneapolis from about 2015, but in this map you can see that the blue shaded areas are primarily people of color living in those areas. The white shaded areas are primarily white people, and the red spaces that you see on this map represent racially restrictive covenants that were utilized to block access to Black, Indigenous, Asian, and Latina people in the earlier part of the 20th century. So from about 1900 to about 1948. And you can see the thing about this map that's really important is that it shows us that those early policies and practices have been remarkably durable in how they have shaped the city of Minneapolis over the last 100 or so years. So this map looks the same today or in 2015 as it did in about 1925. Next slide, please. And I want to also ground us in the why. So Sheree alluded to some of this, and I want to expand a little bit on it. And you can see that in Minnesota, there was a lot of impact from both local policies, regulations like zoning and land use regulation, but also from national policies. And as early as 1900, we see developers in the Twin Cities utilizing those racially restrictive covenants. Then we see the city of Minneapolis and other cities in the region, in fact, all of the cities in the region, going to a process where they have now limited home ownership by zoning. And so this is one way that zoning was used to layer on or emphasize the impact of racially restrictive covenants. And then in the 1950s, we start to see the construction of the federal highway system. And that was based on the siting of that system was based on what are called homeowners loan corporation maps, or HOLC maps, redlining maps. You probably have heard that word before, redlining, which described a way that lenders could deny access to loan instruments to people of color because of where they lived. And so the cities were carved into spaces that were considered high risk or considered good or excellent. And if you lived in an area that was considered good or excellent, you could have access to lending for a home loan. And if you lived in areas that were in the maps, red or yellow, or those redlined areas, you could not have access to conventional financing to purchase a home. So this was another way to layer the impact of racist and biased policies. And then finally, after World War II, many people who fought in World War II availed themselves of the GI Bill to pay for college. And the way that was administered was that the federal government made the money available, but then asked local governments to administer the program. And that's where racist policies came into play. And so many Black and brown people were denied access to GI Bill benefits. Next slide, please. So all of this really resulted in Sheree did a fantastic job of setting that up. This really resulted in a space where people of color have not had access to traditional loan instruments. That persists today in loan rates amongst Black and brown residents of the Twin Cities. And so you saw that in Sheree's slide. So these are layering, but also very persistent policies and practices that can be undone. We just have to commit to correcting those past harms and addressing bias in our future policymaking. One way that we can do that in Minnesota is through the Minnesota Housing Partnership's constitutional amendment proposal, which will be considered this upcoming legislative session, which starts in February. And this would create 3 different funds: the Homeownership Opportunity Fund, the Rental Opportunity Fund, and a Household and Community Stability Fund. This would be funded through a constitutional amendment, and I would encourage you to read more about it at ourhomesmn.org. Next slide, please. We also need to do better when we think about local and state regulation. We need to do better in terms of creating more flexibility and regulation around things like building codes, zoning, and multifamily construction by right. So this is one area where many cities have, about 47 some cities have adopted more what is called inclusionary zoning, but we have 187 cities in the metro. So we have a long way to go toward creating more inclusive housing and greater uptake in the market of housing that is affordable to a wide variety of incomes. And so the benefits of this will be, as we build more housing, greater numbers of houses and units, lower costs. We can also address things like the opportunity that modular housing provides to our community, which is a quicker way to build units. It's also a quieter way to build units. So it has multiple benefits for neighborhoods where construction doesn't last for more than a year. It lasts for maybe a few weeks while they're assembling units, because all the assembly of those units is done off-site. And we think that this also is a way to build our tax base in the Twin Cities. Most of our cities are landlocked and have limited ability to expand tax base without building more dense, more multifamily style housing, or different kinds of housing, condominiums, shared wall construction that can help people achieve housing at a slightly lower rate, or sort of a lower step-in height, and can also then allow them to build equity in those homes so that they have wealth into the future and pass on generational wealth. Next slide, please. Well, I like to say that housing is it's a 3-legged stool. This is the analogy I like to use, that really, when we talk about housing, we're talking about housing stability, which leads to greater academic outcomes for kids. It helps with stable employment, and it helps with just feeling like you're more of a member of the community in terms of how you access that employment and how do you show up as a member of that community from the standpoint of having access to elected officials and decision making. So it's really a combination of access and agency that you're building through stable housing. We found when we were studying this issue in Minneapolis that many of the children who were at the highest risk for dropping out of school were children who also had deep housing instability, and some of them moved every single year of their school career. And you can imagine how disruptive that can be to children, especially young children who have to move every year or multiple times during the year and change schools. So this is it's a grounding issue, as Sheree mentioned. It adds a layer of stability that many of us who grew up in stable housing take for granted. And we can go to the next slide. I also just want to emphasize something that Sheree brought up about affordability and about rent burden. So this map, these two sets of maps actually show between 2000 and 2014 how the city of Minneapolis in particular shifted in terms of access to affordable housing for people of color in particular. And this was measured by income level. And you can see that in 2000, the maps along the top, there were housing units available at 30% of the area median income for a large number of people of color. But by 2015, in many parts of the city, there were no units available. And over a period of the last 20 years, the city of Minneapolis lost 15,000 naturally occurring affordable housing units through market uptake. So primarily people buying units and creating market rate units and taking away those naturally occurring affordable housing units. Next slide, please. So I think there are some important issues to address, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from the panel today. One is that affordable housing production has really lagged in the Twin Cities, and we are not meeting the goals that we have stated for ourselves in terms of being able to deliver affordable and stable housing for people who live at or below 30% of the area median income, and even people who live at up to 80% of the area median income. I think we need to address housing stability. Sheree spoke about her personal experiences with housing. I have been really fortunate to always have stable housing in my life, but I have seen the impacts in my neighborhood on people who are unhoused or underhoused. And in 2020 through almost 2023, almost through this year, we had multiple homeless encampments in my neighborhood in St. Paul. And the impact of watching people live rough in a tent when it's January and February really drove home to me the importance for housing stability in terms of especially people who face barriers to housing, people who are actively using alcohol and drugs, people who have mental health issues. Barriers to housing are steep in the Twin Cities and result in people being chronically homeless. And so that's not even to address the large number of people who kind of couch surf or stay with friends. And so we do have a serious problem that sometimes is hiding a bit underneath the surface, but it is also all around us all the time. We also see deep racial disparities in terms of outcomes around housing. And again, housing in America is a way that people have traditionally built generational wealth. And that is an important avenue for people to access in terms of their ongoing economic health and the health of their children. And then mandating inclusionary zoning at the state level is an important opportunity for the state to address some of the deep disparities that exist in our cities in terms of people's ability to live in areas nearby where they work and where their children attend school. And so again, there's an important racial equity play at work in the housing ongoing housing work that we have to do as a community. So I will pass this back to Sheree. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather, for that helpful framing information. And now I get the great honor of welcoming our panelists. Today, we're going to welcome 3 panelists to discuss in-depth issues around housing, housing affordability, and homeownership. So I'd like to welcome to the panel today, Chris Latondras, President and CEO of Beacon Interfaith Housing, Allison Pence, Director of Community Engagement at Allina Health, and Mai Chong Zhang, Ramsey County Commissioner of District 6. Welcome to all of you. I'd like to first offer you the opportunity to introduce yourself and tell us a little more about your connection to housing, to this topic, why it's personally important to you. So let's start with Chris.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, or I guess good morning for a couple of more minutes. I just really want to thank the center for setting the stage for this conversation, and Sheree and Heather for just how you teed up this important conversation that really reflects an important moment. My name is Chris Latondras, President and CEO of Beacon Interfaith Housing Collaborative, but also recently recovering elected official and policymaker. Some of you may know me from my past role as a Hennepin County Commissioner, including a couple of years as the chair of the Housing and Redevelopment Authority. And, for me, this issue matters a great deal, not just as a policymaker, but as a member of our community and as somebody who, as a teenager, had a family experience of housing instability myself, as my family moved from some time overseas back to the U.S. And it took my dad a couple of years to reestablish his professional practice, and my mom to get plugged back into the school district that she worked. So it's personal, and across my policymaker roles have just seen the moral urgency around this question, and the economic and social impacts of our inaction on this.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris. Allison, would you share a little bit about yourself and what brings you to this topic?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for teeing up the conversation. It's been great to listen. I'm Allison Pence. I'm the Director of Community Engagement at Allina Health, headquartered in Minneapolis. And this housing is a topic that has been an important part of the healthcare conversation for many years. And so I'm excited to share a little bit about how we are starting to address housing. I would say for me personally, I have been working in housing tangentially for many years. I have a background in public health coming into healthcare, and I started my career in working in human services as a home visitor with the Way to Grow program. And so my initial career, I spent my days entering homes of families who were struggling with housing stability and were looking for resources. And I was fortunate enough to learn from them as I was sharing resources with them. And so housing has always been an important part of how I see health and healthcare. And so I am thrilled that organizations like Allina Health are starting to address it as well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for being here and sharing. Mai Chong.
Wonderful. Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here. I am Ramsey County Commissioner Mai Chong Zhang. I represent District 6. That is the majority of the east side of St. Paul. I'm also our Housing and Redevelopment Authority Chair. And housing has been it's impacted so much of my life. As a first generation Hmong American woman, I was the very first child to be born in the United States, and my parents fled here as refugees from the Secret War. And we lived in public housing, the St. Paul public housing, and those were some of the times that provided the most stable housing in my childhood. After we left the public housing, that was where like the housing instability followed. And so I will say that it's generational in the sense that 40 years later, I would say like I still have family members who are still facing housing instability. So it's very close and near to me. On top of that, I've worked in local government in the city of St. Paul for 8 years before I took office this year, and have had a lot of just touch and connection with making policy that is inclusive of everyone.
Thank you for sharing. I'm so grateful to be able to have this kind of fireside chat with you all, your expertise. And I know that we're going to get into some really good things and excite the people around what's possible in fueling inclusive housing. I want to start with you, Mai Chang. This past legislative session, there were significant investments made from the state into housing. What sort of investments did we see made, and what were the main challenges they hoped to address? And does this represent a new direction in housing policy?
Yeah, thank you. I would say it's a start. It is a start, and one of the more transformative tool is the Metro sales tax for housing that will be dedicated towards affordable housing. It's estimated, we're anticipating that we will get about between 11 to 14 million, doubling our current HRA levy. So that is a huge investment where we can put towards and meeting our housing goal. And at the county, we are short about just about 1,800 units of affordable housing, and about 1,800 units at the 30% area median income. And then overall for just affordable housing, it's 4,000 units. And that's just in Ramsey County alone.
Significant investment. And Chris, I'm curious from you, knowing that this is a huge challenge in Minnesota, both for homeowners and renters. We see a housing crisis impacting both. What innovative ideas are giving you hope? You know, what kind of ideas are out there that will push people to rethink what's possible in this space?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And, you know, just to double down a little bit on what we heard from the commissioner, we are in the midst of an extraordinary housing crisis and real opportunity with historic state investments that really represent a down payment on the future that we can walk into if we choose it. You know, from where I sit, broadly speaking, and then I can name some specific signs of hope and some challenges. I think in order to scale to meet the moment, and again, what we're talking about here, regionally, 50% of households housing cost burdened. In Hennepin County alone, on deep affordability, there's roughly 74,000 extremely low income households, only 14,000 units available of housing at that level. And that's a 50,000 unit gap on deep affordability that then directly corresponds to the surge that we've seen on the other side of COVID in family homelessness in particular. We are at 300% of pre-COVID levels on family homelessness as we sit here today. It's a hair on fire emergency. And so what do we do to meet the moment? Well, it's three things. You know, number one, we need to dramatically scale public investments in housing, even with the $1 billion, which was a historic achievement at the state level. It's we're spending as much over the next 2 years as previously we spent in the last 10. That's still pennies on the dollar of what's going to be required to drive closing those gaps, in particular on deep affordability. You know, number two, we need to strengthen our ecosystem of mission-driven nonprofit housing developers, particularly those that focus on deeply affordable and supportive housing, either as a part of their portfolio or their whole portfolio. Beacon's a developer of deeply affordable and supportive housing across our portfolio. And the third piece is it's really about scaling political will, about dramatically increasing the number of us who are willing to bring our whole hearts, our voices into whether it's the conversations at a city council level where a project approval is going on, particularly with more dollars moving through the system. We're going to see more just transparently fights at a local level as we have community need being met by mission-driven developers and by other members of the community, met with neighbors that for whatever reason don't prefer to have that housing in their own backyard. So we need to scale the political will both for that, but also to go back to the legislature. I mean, even with the private sector, and saying we need more dollars available for this. I think what gives me optimism is, number one, we are seeing a greater emphasis across our local and state governments on deeply affordable and supportive housing. With, affordable housing doesn't happen, period, without significant public subsidy. And where we have limited public dollars, it's my view as a former policymaker and now in this role that we need to direct as many of those dollars to deep affordability with services as possible. And then this sales tax, as has been mentioned a couple of times, people need to be paying attention to this. This is a 1/4-cent sales tax in our region. It's the first time in our state's history where we're creating a permanent revenue stream for housing. Before we'd have to go back to the trough once every other year or so to even get any dollars shaken loose. This is permanent revenues, $200 million in new revenues every single year, year after year for housing. Half of it's going to counties, 1/4 of it's going to cities, 1/4 of it's going into a voucher program. But there's no guarantees that counties, cities spend these dollars in a way that's actually aligned with our values and priorities, which is why everyone on this call needs to educate themselves about this issue and be asking these hard questions of your local government officials in particular. And I say that as a former local government official. But the sign for optimism is that there are these new mechanisms, but we need the political will and an educated residents, educated advocates who can meet the moment and shape these investments moving forward.
Thank you for sharing that, Chris. We speaking of asking the questions, we got a question here in the chat already, just about you all's definition of inclusive housing. What does that mean to you? So maybe we'll start with Mai Chang and then Chris, and then send that to Allison.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Inclusive housing is, of course, about the access, and then it's also about the affordability level. We had mentioned about these various area median income, and I would say that's what we mean by building the infrastructure and building the units that folks at all different income levels can access it. Because ultimately, we as a collective community, we pay a cost for not housing our communities through, it was mentioned earlier about like having homelessness encampments in our neighborhoods, having unstable families and households moving around frequently, and then not investing in our workforce, like the future of our kids, basically. Where they're not going to be able to get the tools and the education that they need to succeed in the future too. So I would say like that's what we mean about being inclusive. It's one where everyone can access housing and the type of housing that they need.
Yeah. Chris, what would you add?
Yeah, just to weigh in briefly on that. Yeah, I mean, we need investments across an entire continuum. If you think about our residents who are not just housing unstable right now, but experiencing homelessness, there's a whole body of work that's about strengthening our shelter capacity and infrastructure. But what we're really talking about here is what does it take to create long-term permanent housing solutions, whether that's rental or homeownership for folks. And if you think of that as a continuum, there's various public investments, private sector investments across that continuum that can drive it. So I define sort of inclusive housing is anything that makes it possible for somebody who might not otherwise be able to afford to move out of being cost burdened to be in a home. But again, there's a lot of definitions thrown around. When we talk about deeply affordable and supportive housing, we're talking about that housing that part of the continuum that's just above exits from homelessness, that's directly correlated with our ability to move people from housing insecurity into housing stability. And it needs to be a major emphasis moving forward.
Yeah, thank you for that, Chris. Allison?
Yeah, I would agree with both of my colleagues about definitions. I would also add the other components of people's lives that are contributing to housing instability, often related to mental health, related to physical disabilities, various disabilities that really preclude their ability to maintain housing stability. We know, just coming from a healthcare setting, we know that the role of mental health and housing is cyclical. You really can't have one without the other. And so mental health, and what I've heard many times from housing developers and various folks, is just the challenges of maintaining housing if you are experiencing profound mental illness, and also physical disabilities. Just some housing is not appropriate for people with physical disabilities, meaning they can't access the services they need inside housing. So I would say cost burden, absolutely. There are also some health related and physical components as well.
Thank you. I beautifully said, so comprehensive. The reason why I think this is the place to be today. Allison, but back to you. I think, we're clear that affordability is a really huge issue for our communities and for individuals and for families, as we've already discussed. But I'm interested in what you've heard from employers who are struggling because there is limited housing availability. We know that Alina has made some bold choices to strategically invest in housing to support its workforce and community. So why did Alina take on that challenge? What have you seen? What's been your approach?
Yeah, so I would say Alina has really approached our work in the housing space. It's brand new to us. It new within the last few years. It very much came out of our diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging strategy that we created following the murder of George Floyd. We made a bold public commitment to this community and to central Minnesota and western Wisconsin, where we have facilities, and essentially committed that we are going to address the major issues that is facing this community. And so we started tackling those one after another. It's taken 3 years at this point still to get our impact investment work off the ground and really starting to flow, but we are starting to see the outcomes that we were hoping to achieve. And so I would say when we look at our work in community as a large employer in the state of Minnesota, as a large healthcare provider in Minnesota, and as a significant community member, all of those kind of overlap in terms of who we're trying to reach. So we understand that impact investments we are making in community will affect our employees, and it will also affect our patients. And so all of the data we have from all of those different components, they very much overlap in terms of our decision making and where we're making the choices. We chose to do this because we have a role to play in this. We are a major organization in this state, and we have an obligation to help.
Thanks, Allison. It's a great pivot, because I'm also curious from Mai-Chang and Chris, what are counties and cities and maybe municipal government's role to play to align with employers' work, specifically in maybe workforce housing?
Yeah, at the county level, we have an economic competitive inclusion plan that really drives where we are investing in our public dollars. So at the HRA, we invested in, the 30% area median income, where we would like to be the last one to fund projects, right, to close the gap for a lot of the development projects. In addition to that, we used our ARPA funds, or our federal funds, during the pandemic, ARPA funds and the CARES Act, to invest in more deeply affordable housing. And then we also have other tools that we have, like our community development block grant and other investment tools that we have. I would say one policy piece that we are also thinking about is also the investing in our newer developers or emerging and diverse developers to build wealth in our communities. And in addition to that, they are able to bring in and pull in financial capital from different sources and not from traditional banks too. So I would say those are just some of the innovative things that we have done in investing in emerging and diverse developers.
Yeah. Chris?
Yeah, just to bring a real human perspective to this, Beacon is currently developing a 50-unit multifamily project in Hopkins called Vista 44. That's specifically for families. It's specifically for families at 30% of the area median income and below, and with a service provider to help them achieve not just housing stability, but stability in other areas of their lives. I'm a parent of a 5-year-old and an 8-year-old, and I had an opportunity to go down there the other day with my then 4-year-old. He just turned 5, and I thought it would be pretty exciting for him to see this new project going up, and it's a construction site and all that, a lot of activity. And I said, Hugo, this is where we're building some homes for families, moms and dads, caregivers, and their kids who don't have a place to live right now. And as we were walking out of there, he was a little bit more quiet than usual, and he finally looked up to me and said, Dad, I've got a question. I said, well, yeah, what's up, buddy? And he said, where are they living now? And that's a question that is, with the simplicity that only a 4-year-old can articulate it, is really the question, the critical consciousness question of our time on housing. And the fact is, that building that's serving families, it's not workforce housing, right? It's deeply affordable housing. But I like to think that those will be families that will be participating. They're going to, in our economy, they're going to be working for, it's right on a light rail station that's going to unlock, access to employers in the Southwest Metro. They're going to be participants in our economy. And it almost didn't get done. A project like that, like every single one of these projects, or at least most of them, there's a groundswell of resistance. They're not only, you not only have to marshal, it's like a hero's journey every time you're just trying to pull together the capital needed to make these projects happen, the service dollars, but then there's the political will piece. And I imagine the power. That's why I'm so thrilled you've set the table this way with government, with nonprofits, with the private sector. I mean, imagine the power of a movement that brought the private sector, private individuals, community organizations, so that, whether we're going to the legislature or we're going to a local project approval, listen, I'm a starry-eyed advocate. I'm all here for us starry-eyed advocates, like showing up and, bringing our full hearts and voices to the work. But there's incredible power in building a multi-sector advocacy coalition that makes it possible. And I'm going to say it's going to be needed if we're actually going to see a proper return on investment, in particular these sales tax dollars. We need a coalition of the private sector, nonprofit organizations, private individuals coming together and saying, this is our theory for how these dollars need to get spent. Now, local governments, counties, cities, we're in charge of these dollars, not you. We vote you into office. Now it's time to align these programs to our real needs.
Yes, Chris, you make such a key point here, and part of the beauty of us all being here together today is thinking about our cross-sector opportunity to get behind one issue and push as far as we can with the momentum that we can. I can recall many years ago working in Hennepin District Court and observing racial disparity in housing court around eviction. And then moving into becoming a leader in a housing nonprofit here to participate in really transformative research around what it takes to close the Black home ownership, the gap in Black home ownership, understanding all of these things. And so I feel like I can't have this conversation with you all today without thinking about also housing affordability and the intersection of anti-displacement. Right? So how are you all thinking about how we're balancing anti-displacement and affordability? And particularly, how do we reckon with the impact of gentrification on Black and Brown communities as we think about these housing strategies. I'll toss that out to maybe Mike Chong to start.
Yeah, I would say, we have to follow and make sure that development happens without the displacement. And that is something that I've heard consistently, and especially from our district councils in my time working at the city, our Frogtown Neighborhood Association. And that was the big piece that drove around community involvement, and also asking for what community benefits would look like for each type of development that happens. And that has also been incorporated in the city's plan. So I'm very happy to see that a lot of there are some city partners here, and that those are some ideas that could be taken away. That your planning documents are what's going to help you guide your investments and your priorities. To also state that explicitly, and that could be the basis for it. In addition, I wanted to just mention about this workforce housing piece that, it's not just housing that's like the cost for households. The second biggest cost is also transit or transportation. And, for businesses, look to where the transportation plans are happening. If you move to a place, think about like how your workers will get there, and also what are you paying for your workers. Those are a lot of the things that will help keep families stable, if they're paid well, and also if they can get to the workplace that you need them to get to. For example, we invested in the Gold Line, and I saw someone from Washington County here, where it's going to connect downtown St. Paul to Woodbury, where a lot of their retail establishments are. And so I think that's just a huge opportunity for thinking about how we make housing affordable. And you could do that by, increasing wages and or also decreasing other costs and investments in our infrastructure.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and Heather shared in her opening remarks a little bit about efforts in the space of inclusionary zoning and how that is related to and informing businesses and business community strategy. Allison, as a healthcare organization, what is data telling you about the impact of housing on health? I'm really curious, and maybe I'll pose to everyone following Allison how this data can transform discussions, even in other spaces beyond just the healthcare industry. But first, starting with Allison.
Yeah, so data, healthcare relies on data to drive our strategy, whatever we're working on. But we actually have been surveying our patients at every primary care visit. We give patients a survey essentially asking about their social determinants of health. What are their health-related social needs? Is it related to food? Is it related to housing? Do they have any needs? I'm sure all of us have probably taken this survey at this point. It's happening across every organization and every healthcare situation now. So we have been surveying our patients for the last few years, and we just surveyed our 500,000th patient. So we suddenly have data that is actually starting to be rich enough where we can start to see trends. And what we have seen is that our patients who are identifying housing instability, meaning they tell us they either are unstably housed or they are experiencing homelessness, or they are not moving from housing instability into stable housing after repeated visits. What we are finding is those folks are not meeting their overall health goals. So we're talking about cancer screenings, immunizations, all of the things that as healthcare providers, as our society, people who are experiencing housing instability are not meeting their health goals. Should not be rocket science to those of us who work in this field, but it's showing up in the data, which means it's going to start to get attention. So from our perspective, we are now starting to look at which of our clinics are showing our patients are screening for highest amounts of housing instability. I can tell you right now, they are in downtown St. Paul and downtown Minneapolis. That is where our two sets of clinics have the highest levels of housing instability, all of our patients. And we can absolutely tie it to quality outcomes, which is really important, especially to the insurance companies. So it those are the things that we are starting to see. And I would say from an employer standpoint, what we are finding is that, especially related to this kind of anti-displacement affordability standpoint, there are a lot of partners out there that are able to address these topics for us, with us, meaning we can make investments in CDFIs, CDCs, organizations that are building housing. There are specific organizations serving different populations, and we can make investments in those organizations, and they can do the work that we want to see happen. It allows them to identify where the need is greatest, put their resources, take our resources, use us as leverage to get more resources. We are seeing that happening a lot all of a sudden. The state is suddenly quite interested when a partner shows up with a impact investment from Allina Health as part of that. So we've had a number of community partners go to the state for dollars with that. So from an employer standpoint, if the concern is we can't do this, housing is too big, it's too hard, we're not in the housing business, you can do it. It is possible. And there are a lot of experts and there's a lot of expertise already in community. It's just finding folks who are meeting the needs and partnering with them. And oftentimes it is bringing our dollars to the table and letting them do the work that they are best suited to do.
Allison, that is a strategy that gives me a lot of hope.
It is working really well. We are seeing it. We are getting a lot of inquiries from partners who are looking for that initial investment. It gives them leverage when they go to the state. And it allows them to do the work that they've wanted to do for so long. And it's not from a dollar investment, it's not building housing size investment from an organization of our size. It's making an initial investment and helping them leverage.
Yes, it is so what you've shared is so important. And a couple of themes that I want to pull is the ability to use your data and disaggregate it. And we talk here at the center about race, place, and income, and that you're already able to identify areas and communities and populations that could benefit from targeted investment. And then identifying the partners that are already on the ground able to do that work effectively, and just amplifying that with your investment from where you sit. These are for sure strategies that I think everyone should be taking, rolling with and thinking about how they apply where they sit. I'm curious, Mai Chang, Chris, anything that you would add about what we can learn across other sectors about what Allison has discovered in her own organization's data?
You know, I might just jump in on this social determinants of health thing and underscore how, particularly, again, going back to this idea of deeply affordable and supportive housing, it's housing and supports, it's housing and human services. Like there's an enormous hero's journey, again, as I mentioned, in marshaling the capital needed for the bricks and mortar and then to own and operate that. But when we're serving the kinds of populations that are often served with our greatest needs, most vulnerability, especially coming out of the pandemic, against the backdrop of the opioid crisis, we know that individual populations have different needs, and we have to match them with services. So there's a whole body of work here that's emerging. It's norming with policymakers around definitions of supportive housing and understanding, like at the state level, for example, we have, Minnesota housing, but we also have health and human services. How do we knit those together? And gosh, again, the insights, the data, the voices, the political will building and power of the private sector, particularly given our health sector in Minnesota, in helping us tell that story and knit that together, both in marshaling the resources needed to do the supportive services work in this housing, and then also convincing and partnering, locking arms with policymakers in knitting this together in more comprehensive ways. We've started to do that, but we haven't walked into that future yet. And we're going to have to, against the backdrop of everything happening in our communities right now.
Yeah, I would also add that We absolutely need businesses as partners to advocate for development to happen. For example, I had mentioned about raising wages as a tool, but even with increased wages, if communities are not building housing, you are not going to get the workforce that you need. And that is what I hear across, even in greater Minnesota, where employers are looking for those skilled workers, but there is not housing there to attract the workers to move there. So I would say supporting in the development of housing would be greatly needed and appreciated. And I would say that as local electeds, that hearing from businesses would mean a lot in weighing that about development. Um, there are some other examples that I can share here very briefly, but our Director of Workforce Solutions, Ling Becker, had some great insight as I talked to her about this panel. And she also mentioned about like businesses leveraging their capital, right? Whether you have a master lease and you can establish relationship with other property owners or management companies, and you can say that these are workers that are working for the company, and that you can guarantee that will be maintained, so that employers can secure the housing there. Other ideas that we've seen across the country is mortgage assistance. Businesses with employees interested in purchasing a home, they can act as a silent second mortgage for the employees that otherwise don't have the financial need. And then also leveraging existing reserve funds for loans. Some businesses are leveraging their reserve funds to offer loans to employees to helping with their first and last month rent or deposit, often required in the rental market. And then one of the final other ones is like build or buy, right? Employers with the capital are building and they are buying housing for their employees. So I would say those are just some of the few things that large employers especially can help with.
Thank you for laying that out because, to the point that Allison made earlier, sometimes employers can think of housing as so big. Where do we start? Where do we jump in? And maybe even where can we have the most bang for our buck? Where can we see a return on investment? And these ideas kind of generate what all is possible with creative thinking and where we sit in our seats, what we can do. And it takes the limits off. We can think outside of the box in supporting workforce housing. So this is just a powerful examples about how we can take action. Just another call to action for our participants here to connect to the people across sectors that you see represented in the chat and see what's good. We talked a little bit too about the constitutional amendment, and I'd love to hear from all of you because the similar thread here is that we really do need everybody at the table from where they sit to move something like this. And so I'm curious, what do you see as the pathway forward, moving something like this constitutional amendment forward? I'll start with Allison and then to Mai Chong and then Chris.
I would say, so this kind of moving the constitutional amendment forward really is going to rely on a different set of kind of skills from employers, in the sense that we have government affairs teams at every level of government in the state. Most large employers do. And it's really getting this topic to the top of the government affairs teams. Legislative strategy. I mean, every organization in this state comes up with a legislative strategy every year. And so it is folks who are understanding the needs and have insight into what the constitutional amendment means, what it could mean for the organization, and tying hopefully some of the data that organizations have about their own employees, about whoever they're serving, whether it's customers, patients, the needs, and really starting to talk, I think, collectively. I know as healthcare organizations, we have started talking about housing collectively, really for the first time ever, I would say, within the last year. all of the major healthcare providers really starting to talk about how do we work together in some way. And so I would imagine that this will be part of our government relations, our legislative strategies going forward. I think that is one area that if it's a different voice at the Capitol than the traditional housing voices, I think if employers engage in that way, that will also have a significant impact.
Yeah, I would just add that, again, even having the business perspective and communities input and support in that would make such a big difference across the state. And this is going to take a lot of hearing from multiple stakeholders, to be able to move the state and also to be able to get it onto the ballot. I'm fortunate that I'm in St. Paul, where our current local policymakers do understand about the different types of needs of housing, right? With the different affordability levels. But let's be honest, there are a lot of like NIMBYism, even in St. Paul, Minneapolis too, that residents are very fearful about what affordable housing could do or impact their values of their homes. But again, I say that the cost is just like homelessness encampments that would even drive the values down even further. So I would say just getting more support and diverse perspectives onto this would greatly help that.
Yeah, I'll just add, we will not end homelessness in Minnesota. We will not scale to meet the moment, the extraordinary gaps on affordability and really the crisis for Minnesota families and residents without permanent, large scale, year after year resources coming from the state to address this issue. That does not exist right now. We got a bite at that apple this last session through the local option sales tax. Again, this modest quarter-cent tax on every transaction that then is generating 200 million in revenues. That's a significant impact. We need to do that statewide. And the path to achieving that, like number one, it goes through the legislature on a majority vote. They can decide whether to put this on the ballot. That would be in order to amend the Constitution, we need a ballot initiative. And then it's really up to every single Minnesotan to say, yes, we need this. Well, what Minnesotan wants to sign up for a new tax without understanding why it matters? And so I think there's sort of a two-part thing here that all of us can actually start working on today. Number one is, what's it going to take to move the legislature in a direction that they approve this to get it on the ballot? But just because it goes on the ballot doesn't mean it becomes true. What are we doing today? What are the actions we're taking today in philanthropy, in the private sector, in every single sector to make the case that we need a permanent source of revenue for housing so that this becomes a bipartisan, multi-sector, and ultimately nonpartisan cause on the ballot of every Minnesotan? I think that in order to get this done, Minnesotans are going to need to see this as essential for our future. And again, as it was music to my ears, Allison, like it can't be the usual suspects. It can't be just the usual housing advocates making that case. We need trusted messengers in every single corner of the state, because this is an issue that impacts us, everywhere from, Rondo to Rochester to the Iron Range. I mean, we need housing in every corner of the state, and we need permanent revenues to get it done.
So important. I just want to throw in one more thought, and I welcome all of our participants to add questions into the chat, because that'll be our next segment. But you all have talking about or hinted to this idea of NIMBYism, but also that this is essential for all of us, because we're all going to do better when our communities have safe and affordable housing. There's just benefits to employers, benefits to individuals, social determinants of health are positively impacted. So how might we articulate that to everyone. You know, what are our talking points? How can we share with people the important key points when maybe helping to adjust or transform people's mind or people's mental models around not in my backyard to more of a sentiment of, you know, there's danger in creating neighbors with nothing to lose. You know, how would you all share with our audience key points around that?
You know, I just responded to the last question, but I'll jump in briefly here and say, you know, I think the Center for Economic Inclusion powerfully models this in the way that you drive the narrative around racial justice and racial inclusion. I mean, you're out here, certainly there's a moral imperative rooted in our history, our present, and the future we need to walk into, but you're out here making the economic case. You're talking about why it makes sense for community safety. All of these things go together. And what we know is that housing is extraordinarily expensive, but homelessness is actually more expensive, like dollars and cents. And it comes not only at a greater moral cost to all of us, but it takes an extraordinary toll on vulnerable residents. And it has a social cost, as an economic cost, as a public safety cost for all of us. So I think we need to do a better job, again, across our sectors of ensuring that this is a bipartisan issue, nonpartisan cause rooted in meeting people where they're at. If you're moved by the moral argument, great. We want you here on the front lines, but we need to do more than just make that argument.
Right. And I would also add that we need to see housing as infrastructure, and that people are our greatest asset in infrastructure in our state. And that is what's going to keep the businesses here and keep our economy flourishing, right? So we need to see housing as infrastructure, and that it's important to our economy, just as our highways are, just as our businesses are, just as the services in our schools are. So I would say that that's the biggest piece. And what you've already shared earlier in the presentation about like seeing in other communities where there aren't a lot of access to housing or to affordable housing and or just a workforce housing, is that employers are leaving those cities. And that is just super important to just relay that across to the state, to our state legislators across the state to support this.
Yeah, I would agree. And I would add, I think housing has become so expensive for everybody that I would argue that from a NIMBY perspective, there are a lot more people that are one missed rent payment away from losing their housing altogether than most people really realize. And so I think this is very much a we can't afford to lose anyone conversation, as both Chris and Mai Chong have said. In this state, we need every single employee we can get. It is every single one of our employers is dealing with the fact that we don't have enough people working in this state. We can't afford to have people sitting on the sidelines or leaving because they can't afford to pay for housing here. So I would argue that it's in everybody's best interest. And if it comes down to personal finances, I mean, how many of us could miss a rent or a mortgage payment and still live in our houses and homes? So I think it's it's closer to people than a lot of times they like to admit. But we as a state can't let that stop us from really trying to build up the infrastructure we need, because we can't afford to lose any more employees. We're not going to have the same level of service that we are used to as Minnesotans if we don't have housing.
Powerfully stated. Mai Chong, were you gonna hop back in? Maybe not. Okay.
Sorry, I did not unmute myself successfully. I just wanted to add to Allison's point that you know, you're spot on, and I think the other part of it is just that, you know, we just can't say that affordable housing is something that others need. You know, it's, we actually all need it, and you lifted up to the point that, you know, I think we've used race as a way to divide us, and also our geographic locations, that it's actually coming down to past economic policies, right? And also workforce policies that have kept people out, and our safety nets have just gotten smaller and smaller. And we are really one paycheck away and one big medical debt away from being like housing insecure.
Yeah. Well said. I mean, so important for us to again remember humanity as part of this conversation, that it could easily be any of us. And so we're fighting for all of us. I would love to be able to pivot because we have some really good questions in the chat. And what I'll do is just read them, and you all come off mute and respond to whatever sits with you. So for our first question, and I'll read the full thing so that everyone in the audience can have the full context here. Many of our efforts to provide housing aim to address issues related to individuals with low or no income, which is necessary. However, I'm curious if there are broader initiatives to support people who may appear financially stable, but are underhoused or living below their means due to systemic racism, student loans, and other factors. It appears that these groups who are not eligible for most assistance, but are not considered wealthy, often have limited resources. Wonder if there are any programs or solutions available to help them.
Well, I think what's rattling around underneath that questions are not only questions of, you know, power, race, justice, but also you can't have this conversation about housing. We've talked about the social determinants of health aspect of this. I mean, income is another significant part of this conversation, and we know that our economy is not working the same for everyone. We know coming out of the pandemic and even before, what we've seen is a K-shaped recovery where the part of the economy is like you know, doing really well at generating wealth for a smaller and smaller number of people, while more and more folks are struggling to get by. And I mean, that is a urgent topic that connects with workforce. It's an urgent topic that connects with educational opportunity, health, all of these other topics. And so, yeah, I mean, I'll just speak for Hennepin. I'd be curious to get Commissioner's perspective on this at Ramsey. I mean, there's a whole suite of, you know, workforce initiatives on, Hennepin County has a guaranteed income pilot that it's looking at in terms of trying to figure out how you supplement existing incomes to get people closer to where they need to be in order to sustain their lives. And as you said, Cherie, earlier, that happens to be more and more of us these days. And so it's an issue that should both resonate broadly, but also should have a broad set of policies and programs aimed at addressing it.
Yeah, I would also just add that one of the things that we invest in is just our infrastructure too, right? That regardless of race, income, or abilities, that we all have access to it, and that's our parks, our libraries, our roads, and then the other part is we have changed or added language that's super important, right, in our program as policymakers, to address the historic, just the historic racism where it has left generations out of home ownership. Is we changed it to like from not just like first-time home buyers, but first-generation homeowners. And that opened up the door for so many more people to see that they can apply for it too. So I would say that's just one example of how some policy changes or just change in language really matters. And that's also something that the state has started to create a program on too for first generation home buyers.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you both. We have another question that speaks more to Black and Brown owned development. And for how can we support maybe the smaller emerging developers who understand housing and racism, maybe understand issues of systemic marginalization and have cultural relevancy and competency to make them successful in this housing development space. Any thoughts around how cities and counties can connect to the small and build maybe or help to scale smaller emerging developers who are also kind of on the outsides of this conversation?
Well, I can start, but not from a city or county perspective, but you have to intentionally do the work. We, as part of our impact investment strategy, we have funded a number of small funds that specifically serve specific communities. We have the Minnesota Fund, which is a Native American CDFI. We have Fortis Capital, which is focused on BIPOC businesses. We have Tundra VC, or Venture Capital Fund, which is focused on BIPOC, LGBTQ+, veterans, non-binary. There are organizations that are specifically doing this work in communities. It literally requires institutional commitment. And I'm fortunate in the sense that our impact investment strategy is coming out of our diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging commitment. And so we are moving in that direction, and we are intentionally trying to find these small developers that are reaching these specific communities and putting dollars into them. We had one of these funds that we tried to give them an investment and they accepted it and then came back and said, you know what, we actually can't accommodate an investment that large yet. Can we have half now and half later? And we said yes, because some of these are so small, and we appreciate that in order to do this work, there has to be a substantial infrastructure in place already. So it is just an intentional commitment that has to be made. And hopefully these organizations will get larger and then can start to entertain larger dollars.
Yeah, I think there's another significant role for governments to play, particularly local governments. I mean, a lot of folks look at us as sort of, deliverers of service and administrators of various programs, but we're major employers. We move significant money through our system. I mean, Hennepin County is a $2.6 billion enterprise. Our contracts and procurements is another side of our role as a player in our economy. It's why in Hennepin County, one of our more recent lines of business is our disparity reduction domain and line of business, but we've moved a significant portion of our contracts into that office to specifically look at, gosh, how are we going about this in a way that not only delivers on the sort of policy promises and programs of government, but does that in a way that contributes to the economic vitality, in particular, of the communities that we are most directly trying to benefit with an eye towards disparity reduction. And I do think that that's the puck that governments need to skate to, that the private sector needs to skate to, that this is not just about having a DE&I initiative and our ESG goals, that we set up a fund or a community foundation or a philanthropic effort to, sprinkle some dollars into our community. Let's actually look at the way that money moves through this enterprise and who it's going to in the core of our business. And oh, by the way, like, if you want to then count that towards your DE&I and your ESG goals, those start to add up pretty quickly, and actually in a way that's more significantly scaled perhaps than just sort of attacking these issues as through sort of a more philanthropic lens. There needs to be structural changes and commitments from our employers, from whether that's private sector or government.
Yeah, I will add that that's a great point, Chris, that you had mentioned. So I'll mention first then the contracting and procurement that we as a county have started looking at into our practices in that way, and we'll be participating in the state's racial disparities, racial disparity contract to see where that contracting is happening and where it's going. But for the smaller contracts, right, where we are relying on the talent and the expertise and knowledge of individuals in our communities of color, we have started, we will be eliminating some of the insurance requirements that place a huge burden and barrier for smaller consultants to even access and bid on a lot of the contracts that the county has. So we've looked at that, and we explicitly stated, and this was the leadership of our CFO, Alex Kutza, in naming that, you know, systemic racism is built into our practices. And we will need to unpack those about what limits and barriers that stops our community members from being able to get contracts with the county. The second one is also our HRA levy. We used it to also fund the Emerging and Diverse Developers Program, and that will assist new developers with less than 5 housing development projects in acquiring and building housing. And so it's a pipeline and a support for newer developers that includes, I believe, technical assistance from a community development group, as well as from a law firm. I'm blanking on the names, but to provide them technical experience, support and assistance, which leverage just huge investments into in private support and capital. And as a result of that, we're building the pipeline and have also created a fund dedicated just for emerging and diverse developers to apply in. And the maximum amount was about 500,000. And we just allocated that out this last, just yesterday, on Wednesday. So, I mean, Tuesday, so 2 days ago. So those are just some examples of what we're doing, and we're going to build a pipeline. And my hope and vision is to push that forward so that we can increase that pool and also make that a priority for all our overall contracting around in our housing investments. So we build that generational wealth.
Thank you so much. You all pulled a thread that is so important to us here at the center. We just released a report around our racial equity dividends index for the public sector that offers racial equity standards around just that, how cities and counties are procuring services and how that is an opportunity to advance racial equity and economic inclusion in such a powerful way that we don't always think about. And it's not, you know, it's not atypical to see that cities and counties aren't necessarily thinking about that as a levy for racial equity and economic justice, as you all have mentioned. So just a incredible point that I want to put an even finer point on, and then another call to action to our participants, that if you live in a city or you work in a city that was not part of our racial equity dividends index for the public sector, please send some emails. You know, make some calls, send some emails, knock on some doors, because this is such an important way for us to realize that opportunity that was raised in that question and that our panelists spoke about. We are at time. We had a couple of more questions, and I know that our team here will do our due diligence to do some follow-up via email and get answers to those questions and even circulate it to all participants. But I want to take this moment to thank you. Thank you all for being here. And thank you, Allison. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Mai Chong, for being part of this panel and really sharing some inspiring strategies to fuel inclusive housing. I feel inspired. I hope our participants feel inspired, and that we're walking away with some new information and new awareness that can help us take action. So with that, thank you. Thank you. I want to share with you all, as all of our participants and attendees, to please save the date. The center will be hosting our Powering Inclusion Annual Summit May 2nd. So please do check us out on our website for more information and to register and join us for an annual summit. You don't want to miss this. Also, I hope that you all will take a moment after our program here concludes to complete a brief survey. We will send out a brief survey just to hear from you about your experience of this forum and get some insights on how we can bring even more forums and speaker series to you all in the new year. Next slide, please. I also hope that you all will consider how you can support our mission through making a gift. Please check us out on our website and consider making a gift that really helps support the work that you've heard us talk about here today, the work that our small yet mighty team is doing, and supporting our mission to really transform our region in a way that sustains change for everyone. And last but not least, next slide. Thank you. Thank you for being here, and I hope that you join us again. Take care.